Good evening, and welcome back to Boring History to Sleep. Tonight, I'd like you to settle in, relax, and travel with me to a place where even the air seems too hot to breathe. Now, imagine you wake up long before sunrise. The stars still shimmer above the endless Egyptian desert, and the sand beneath your bare feet feels surprisingly cool for now. In a few short hours, that same ground will become so hot it could burn your skin through thin linen sandals. Ahead of you rise towering cliffs of golden limestone. Hidden deep inside them is the tomb of a pharaoh whose name may one day outlive entire civilizations. And somehow, helping build that tomb is your job. There are no electric fans, no air conditioning, no insulated water bottle waiting beside you. No weather app warning that today's temperature will climb to nearly 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The desert doesn't send notifications. It simply tries to cook everyone equally. Yet every morning, thousands of skilled Egyptian workers picked up stone hammers, copper chisels, ropes, and baskets, then walked into one of the harshest working environments on Earth. At first glance, it almost sounds impossible. How could anyone survive hours of exhausting labor beneath a sun so fierce that even modern tourists often retreat to the shade before lunchtime? Did they possess some forgotten secret? Were they simply tougher than we are? Or have we misunderstood their lives all along? Because here's where history becomes far more interesting than the myth. Contrary to what countless movies have taught us, these workers weren't mindless slaves collapsing beneath gigantic stones while cruel overseers shouted from the sidelines. The real story is quieter, smarter, and in many ways, far more remarkable. It is a story of careful planning, ingenious survival, unexpected comforts, and ordinary people who learned how to outsmart one of the most unforgiving climates on Earth. So tonight, let's leave behind the Hollywood version of ancient Egypt. Instead, let's step into the sandals of the men who carved eternity from solid rock, one careful strike at a time. Because once you discover how they truly survived the desert, you may never look at the pyramids or the royal tombs the same way again. The desert awakens long before the sun appears. Imagine opening your eyes inside a modest mud brick house in the workers' village of Deir el-Medina. The air is still cool enough to breathe comfortably. Somewhere nearby, a donkey brays impatiently. A woman grinds grain into flour while the smell of freshly baked bread drifts through the narrow streets. Children are still asleep curled beneath linen blankets. For a brief moment, the desert almost feels gentle, but everyone knows that kindness has an expiration time. As the eastern horizon begins to glow orange, dozens of craftsmen step into the quiet streets. Stonecutters, painters, sculptors, plasterers, carpenters. Each man carries the tools of his trade with the casual confidence of someone who has repeated the same journey hundreds of times. They are not marching under chains. They are walking to work. That distinction matters. For generations, Hollywood taught us that Egypt's greatest monuments were built almost entirely by enslaved labor. Modern archaeology paints a far more complicated and far more human picture. The royal tomb builders, especially those of the New Kingdom, were highly skilled specialists employed by the state. Think less anonymous workforce, and more government employees with an extremely dangerous office. Their destination lies beyond the village. A winding path climbs into the barren cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. The landscape feels almost otherworldly, No trees sway in the wind. No rivers sparkle nearby. Only endless stone dry valleys and towering limestone walls reflecting the rising sunlight. By mid-morning, those pale cliffs begin acting like enormous ovens. They don't merely receive heat, they throw it back at you. Standing there could feel like being trapped between two gigantic campfires. Temperatures in Upper Egypt regularly soared to extraordinary levels during the hottest months. Even today, summer afternoons can exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius in exposed desert locations. Without modern refrigeration, synthetic fabrics, or climate control, surviving that environment required more than endurance. It demanded planning every single day. The desert was never an opponent you defeated once. It was an argument you had to win again every sunrise. Picture yourself climbing toward the royal tomb. Your sandals scrape against loose gravel. The morning breeze disappears. The sunlight becomes almost blinding, bouncing off pale stone in every direction. You wipe sweat from your forehead, only for another drop to replace it immediately. Your linen tunic clings to your skin. Your hands tighten around a copper chisel polished smooth by years of use. The workday has barely begun. Already, the sun is making its presence very clear. It's like receiving 20 passive-aggressive emails before you've even finished your first cup of coffee. Except the email is a giant ball of fire hanging over your head. Inside the unfinished tomb, however, the world changes. The entrance offers a welcome shadow. Deeper corridors remain noticeably cooler than the open desert outside. Torches flicker against freshly carved walls. The rhythmic sound of hammer-striking chisel echoes through narrow chambers. Tap, tap, tap. Hundreds of careful blows. Not rushed, not frantic. Every line carved into stone must be precise. One careless strike could damage weeks of work. Unlike modern office mistakes, there was no convenient undo button. Granite had remarkably poor customer service. These workers weren't simply digging holes. They were constructing eternal homes for kings believed to become divine after death. Every inscription carried religious meaning. Every painted figure had spiritual purpose. Every corridor followed carefully planned measurements. Mistakes weren't merely expensive. They threatened the perfection expected for a ruler's journey into the afterlife. Imagine spending months decorating one room, knowing your supervisor believes the gods themselves will inspect it. Talk about performance anxiety. Despite the harsh conditions, archaeological discoveries reveal something remarkable. The workers left behind evidence of ordinary life. Shopping lists, letters to family, personal complaints, medical records, even humorous sketches scratched onto flakes of limestone. One drawing depicts animals behaving like humans. Another playfully reverses the natural order, showing mice commanding cats. Apparently, ancient Egyptians enjoyed absurd humor just as much as we enjoy internet memes. Humanity has always possessed the remarkable ability to joke about life, even while sweating through it. Of course. That raises an obvious question. If these workers faced such relentless heat day after day, how did they avoid collapsing? Surely determination alone wasn't enough. After all, no amount of positive thinking turns the Egyptian desert into a pleasant spring afternoon. The answer lies not in extraordinary strength, but in extraordinary preparation. The ancient Egyptians quietly developed a collection of practical survival strategies, simple ideas that together allowed thousands of craftsmen to thrive where most modern visitors struggle for a single afternoon. And some of those forgotten techniques might surprise you far more than the heat itself. Here's where history quietly overturns one of its most stubborn myths. If you've ever imagined Egyptian tomb builders staggering across the desert with cracked lips, collapsing from thirst while cruel overseers barked orders, you're not alone. Movies have spent decades convincing us that ancient Egypt was essentially one long sunburned misery montage. Reality, surprisingly, was far more organized, because surviving the desert wasn't about being superhuman. It was about being prepared. Let's begin with the simplest question. How did they stay alive without constantly running out of water? The answer is, they didn't. Water was precious, but it was also planned for. Workers assigned to royal construction projects were supplied with water brought from reliable sources, often transported in large clay jars by teams responsible for provisioning the workforce. Keeping skilled craftsmen alive wasn't an act of kindness. It was an investment. A master stonecutter couldn't carve a pharaoh's eternal resting place if he'd fainted before breakfast. Ancient Egypt understood workforce retention long before human resources became a department. And then there was beer. Yes, beer. Not the frosty pint you might imagine after mowing the lawn. Ancient Egyptian beer was usually thick, nutritious, low in alcohol, and brewed from grains like barley and emmer wheat. It provided calories, minerals, and hydration alongside water. For many workers, it was part of their regular rations. Imagine opening your lunchbox at work and finding your boss has thoughtfully packed you bread, onions, and what historians might generously call a prehistoric protein shake. Except this one had bubbles. Sort of. Food mattered just as much as drink. Archaeological evidence from workers' settlements reveals diets that included bread, beer, onions, garlic, dates, figs, fish, and occasionally meat. To modern ears, that may sound surprisingly modest, but these foods supplied energy salts and nutrients essential for long days of physical labor. Garlic and onions in particular were highly valued and even praised in ancient texts for their health benefits. Whether they truly made workers stronger remains debated. One thing is certain, they probably made conversations inside narrow tomb corridors memorable. Clothing also became a form of survival technology. Instead of heavy garments, Egyptian workers wore lightweight linen woven from flax. Linen breathed remarkably well. It reflected sunlight better than darker fabrics and allowed air to circulate across the skin. Loose-fitting kilts and tunics weren't fashion statements. They were practical engineering. Sometimes history's greatest inventions aren't machines. Sometimes they're simply wearing the right shirt. Now picture the work site itself. From the outside, the Valley of the Kings looked brutally exposed, but much of the actual labor happened inside partially completed tombs. As craftsmen carved deeper into solid limestone, the underground chambers remained noticeably cooler than the blazing cliffs above. The difference could be dramatic. Stepping inside wasn't exactly air conditioning, but after hours beneath the desert sun, it must have felt astonishingly close. History's first climate-controlled office, sponsored entirely by geology. Timing was another secret. The desert follows its own rhythm. Experienced workers understood that the coolest hours arrived shortly after dawn. The most punishing heat came later. Evidence suggests that labor was organized carefully with routines shaped by daylight temperature and the practical realities of desert life. These weren't people randomly swinging hammers until sunset. They were professionals managing both stone and stamina. The sun dictated the schedule. Everyone else simply negotiated with it. Survival also depended on medicine. Ancient Egypt possessed one of the most sophisticated medical traditions of the ancient world. Documents like the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus reveal physicians who understood wounds, fractures, infections, and practical treatments far better than many people expect. At workers' villages, evidence points to medical care for injuries sustained during construction. Broken fingers, sore backs, eye irritation from stone dust, heat-related exhaustion. Building eternity was physically demanding. Fortunately, someone occasionally knew more than walk it off. One of the most remarkable discoveries comes from Deir el-Medina itself. Records show that workers could report illness. Some received time away from work due to sickness or family obligations. Others were absent because they were caring for relatives or attending religious festivals. Reading these attendance records feels strangely familiar. Absent today, bitten by a scorpion, caring for mother, brewing beer. Replace the papyrus with an office spreadsheet, and you've basically discovered history's oldest HR attendance log. But perhaps the greatest survival trick wasn't food, or water, or linen. It was teamwork. No one built royal tombs alone. Stonecutters depended on plasterers. Plasterers depended on painters. Painters depended on scribes who carefully outlined sacred texts before a single brush touched the wall. Every worker relied on someone else. If one person failed, the entire project slowed. The tomb wasn't built by one extraordinary genius. It was built by hundreds of ordinary people becoming extraordinary together. Shem. And maybe that's the biggest surprise of all. For centuries, we admired the monuments, the pyramids, the temples, the royal tombs, but the real miracle wasn't the stone. It was the people who returned every morning, sharing bread, passing water jars, laughing between hammer strikes, looking after injured friends, enduring another day beneath a relentless sun, not because they were fearless, but because they trusted the people working beside them. Yet, there's one final myth we still need to dismantle. Who exactly were these workers? Were they nameless slaves, driven by whips and terror? Or does archaeology tell a completely different story? Because in our next chapter, we'll discover that the men who built eternity may have lived lives far richer and far more respected than most of us have ever imagined. Imagine you've spent your entire life believing one of history's most famous stories. Thousands of exhausted slaves, whips cracking through the desert air, gigantic stone blocks dragged beneath a merciless sun. It is a powerful image. Hollywood loves it. Novels repeat it. Cartoons simplify it. The problem is, history keeps refusing to cooperate. Because the deeper archaeologists dig into ancient Egypt, the more that familiar picture begins to crumble like weathered sandstone. Let's return to the workers' village of Deir el-Medina. Unlike many ancient settlements, this one left behind something extraordinary. Not just houses, not just tools, but voices. Real people speaking across more than 3,000 years. Their grocery lists, their complaints, their love letters, their legal arguments, their attendance records. even their doodles. It's almost as if someone accidentally buried an entire office chat beneath the desert. Except instead of memes, they left ostraka broken pieces of limestone covered with surprisingly relatable messages. The men who carved the royal tombs weren't anonymous laborers pulled randomly from the countryside. They were highly trained specialists: stonemasons, sculptors, draftsmen, painters, carpenters, metal workers. Each skill required years of experience. A single mistake inside a royal burial chamber could ruin weeks of painstaking work. You wouldn't ask a random passerby to restore the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The pharaohs felt much the same about decorating eternity. Many workers lived with their families inside Deir el-Medina, a carefully planned settlement built specifically for them. The village was small but remarkably organized. Rows of mud brick houses lined narrow streets. Children played outside. Neighbors borrowed tools. Women baked bread, brewed beer, spun linen, and managed households while the men worked in the royal necropolis. When evening arrived, the village filled once again with conversation, cooking fires, and the familiar sounds of ordinary family life. History's greatest monuments were built by people who still had to remember to fix leaky roofs. These craftsmen also received wages, not coins. Ancient Egypt didn't operate on a modern cash economy. Instead, workers were paid with carefully measured rations: grain, beer, bread, vegetables, fish, occasionally meat or other valuable goods. Their wages supported entire households. The state understood that skilled labor required reliable supplies. After all, it's difficult to concentrate on painting sacred hieroglyphs when your stomach has started filing formal complaints. One of the most delightful discoveries from Deir el-Medina is evidence of humor. Ancient Egyptians, it turns out, loved jokes. Artists sketched cats serving mice, lions playing board games with gazelles, donkeys performing noble duties. The natural order turned upside down. Some drawings gently mocked authority. Others simply delighted in absurdity. If social media had existed in the New Kingdom, someone definitely would have captioned a drawing of a cat waiting on a mouse when your manager suddenly becomes the intern. Some jokes never really expire. They just switch platforms. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of their lives. Before entering the royal tombs, workers understood they weren't simply constructing architecture. They were preparing the eternal home of a divine king. Every painted star on the ceiling, every carved prayer, every carefully measured corridor, all carried profound religious significance. Imagine spending months writing one sentence, knowing generations believed the gods themselves would eventually read it. Talk about proofreading under pressure. Life, of course, wasn't perfect. Families argued. Illness spread. Accidents happened. Workers injured backs lifting stone. Eyes burned from dust. Copper tools wore down quickly against hard rock. And sometimes, the system that supported them failed. Deliveries of grain arrived late. Beer rations disappeared. Officials made promises they couldn't keep. Patience slowly gave way to frustration. Then something extraordinary happened. Around 1159 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses III, the workers of Deir el-Medina made a decision unlike anything clearly recorded before. They stopped working, not because they rejected the pharaoh, not because they abandoned their craft, but because they hadn't received the food rations they had earned. Instead of quietly enduring the shortage, they walked out. They gathered together. They refused to continue carving royal tombs until officials addressed their complaints. No shouting mobs, no burning buildings, no dramatic revolution, just skilled professionals calmly saying, "We cannot continue until our families can eat." History's first documented labor strike wasn't fueled by politics. It was fueled by empty bread baskets. Remarkably, it worked. Officials negotiated. Supplies were distributed. Work eventually resumed. The surviving papyrus records reveal not chaos, but administration, meetings, complaints, responses, compromise. The documents feel astonishingly modern. Replace the papyrus with email chains, and you'd almost expect someone to write, "Per my previous scroll." This single event changes the way we see ancient Egypt. These workers weren't disposable tools. They possessed enough value, enough organization, and enough confidence to challenge the very bureaucracy serving the king. That doesn't mean life was easy. It certainly wasn't. But it does mean reality was far more nuanced than the familiar image of endless chains and constant cruelty. History rarely fits neatly into simple stories. Real people almost never do. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden beneath the sands. The monuments survived because of extraordinary craftsmanship, but the craftsmen survived because of community. Neighbors shared food. Families supported one another. Knowledge passed from master to apprentice. Entire generations devoted themselves to perfecting skills that would outlast their own names. Ironically, we remember the pharaohs carved into the tomb walls. Yet it was the anonymous hands holding the chisels that made immortality possible. And among those countless unnamed artisans, one man's story still shines brighter than most. Not because he ruled Egypt, not because he commanded armies, but because he left behind something infinitely more personal: his own voice. A craftsman who lived, loved, complained, prayed, made mistakes, and accidentally became one of the best windows into everyday life in ancient Egypt. His name was Pashedu, and in his remarkable journey, we discover that surviving the desert required more than water. It required purpose. We've spent tonight talking about thousands of workers, thousands of footsteps crossing the desert, thousands of hammer blows echoing through silent valleys, thousands of anonymous hands shaping eternity. But history has a funny habit. Sometimes, one ordinary person survives the passage of 3,000 years simply because they left behind enough clues for us to meet them. Tonight, that person is Pashedu, and unlike the pharaohs he served, he never ruled an empire. He never commanded armies. He never wore a golden crown. He simply went to work, day after day, year after year, under one of the hottest suns on earth. Imagine waking before dawn in Deir el-Medina around the reigns of Seti I and Ramesses II. Your wife is already grinding grain for bread. A clay oven glows softly in the corner of your home. Outside, neighbors greet one another while donkeys shuffle through the narrow street. You wrap a fresh linen kilt around your waist, pick up your tools, whisper a short prayer, and begin the familiar climb toward the Valley of the Kings. This is Pashedu's world. Not glamorous, not easy, but deeply meaningful. Unlike many ancient people, Pashedu wasn't invisible to history. Archaeologists discovered his beautifully decorated tomb near Deir el-Medina. Inside, the walls tell us about his beliefs, his family, his hopes, his fears. Instead of celebrating military victories, they celebrate something quieter, a life of honest work. Imagine spending decades helping kings prepare for eternity, then finally creating a small piece of eternity for yourself. There's something wonderfully human about that. Even history's master craftsmen apparently wanted a retirement project. Pashedu held an important position among the royal workforce. He belonged to the community responsible for decorating and constructing the magnificent tombs hidden beneath the desert cliffs. Every painted figure, every carefully carved hieroglyph, every polished surface demanded extraordinary patience. One careless mistake couldn't simply be erased. Stone isn't particularly forgiving. Granite has always maintained a strict no-refund policy. The work itself required remarkable discipline. Inside unfinished burial chambers, Pashedu and his fellow artisans worked by the flickering light of oil lamps. The air smelled faintly of limestone dust and smoke. Voices echoed softly through narrow corridors. One craftsman measured, another sketched, another carved, another painted. Each person trusted the others completely. No single artisan created a royal tomb. It was teamwork transformed into architecture. Long before assembly lines, ancient Egypt had already mastered collaboration. Yet Pashedu's greatest challenge wasn't simply the heat, or the stone, or the exhausting climb through the desert. It was consistency. Imagine repeating incredibly delicate work for decades. Every line mattered. Every symbol carried religious meaning. Every day demanded concentration despite aching muscles and relentless temperatures. Modern workers worry about missing deadlines. Pashedu worried about making mistakes that priests believed might follow a king into eternity. That is a rather intimidating performance review. And then, life reminded him that even the most skilled hands cannot control everything. Like everyone in Deir el-Medina, Pashedu lived within a system that occasionally failed. Food deliveries arrived late. Political instability affected supplies. Families worried. Neighbors complained. The certainty that had sustained the workers for years suddenly felt fragile. For craftsmen whose livelihood depended upon royal administration, these disruptions were deeply unsettling. The desert wasn't the only thing capable of testing human endurance. Sometimes, paperwork was equally dangerous. History changes. Governments stumble. Even empires occasionally forget payday. So what kept Pashedu going? It wasn't wealth. His tomb, though beautifully decorated, was modest compared with those of kings. It wasn't fame. For thousands of years, almost nobody remembered his name. It wasn't power. He remained an artisan throughout his life. His true strength came from something less visible. Purpose. Every morning, he walked toward the cliffs, believing his work mattered. Not only to the pharaoh, not only to the state, but to the cosmic order the Egyptians called Ma'at, the delicate balance of truth, harmony, and justice that held the universe together. For Pashedu, carving stone wasn't just employment. It was participation in something eternal. That belief transformed hardship. The scorching sun became part of the journey. The endless dust became familiar. The heavy tools became extensions of experienced hands. The long climb became routine. Purpose has a remarkable way of changing how humans experience difficulty. The task itself may not become easier, but it becomes easier to endure. Perhaps that's one of history's oldest survival secrets. Not stronger muscles, a stronger reason to keep walking. Centuries passed. Dynasties collapsed. The pharaohs disappeared. The temples fell silent. The empire that once seemed eternal slowly became buried beneath drifting sand. Yet Pashedu's little tomb remained, waiting patiently, until archaeologists opened its doorway and discovered the life of an ordinary craftsman preserved with extraordinary care. Ironically, the kings built monuments so the world would never forget them. Today, many visitors leave Egypt talking about the workers instead. History has a wonderfully ironic sense of humor. Pashedu never imagined millions of people would one day study his life. He simply tried to do good work, support his family, honor his gods, and leave behind something worthy of remembrance. In the end, he succeeded far beyond anything he could have imagined, because through him, we no longer see ancient Egypt as a civilization built only by pharaohs. We see it as a civilization built by ordinary people with dusty hands, patient hearts, and extraordinary determination. And perhaps that is the greatest monument he ever helped create. Well, we've reached the end of our journey across the blazing sands of ancient Egypt. Tonight, we've walked beside craftsmen who rose before dawn. We've climbed dusty paths winding toward the Valley of the Kings. We've stood inside cool limestone corridors while the desert outside shimmered beneath a relentless sun. And perhaps we've left behind a few myths along the way, because the greatest surprise wasn't that these men survived 120-degree desert heat. The greatest surprise was how they survived it. At the beginning of tonight's story, it was tempting to imagine these workers as almost superhuman. People who somehow ignored thirst, ignored exhaustion, ignored pain, as if ancient Egyptians possessed a secret modern science that disappeared with the pharaohs. History, however, offers a far gentler answer. They survived, not because they were stronger than us, but because they understood something timeless. Preparation often defeats brute strength. Think back to everything we've discovered. Fresh water carried carefully across the desert, nutritious bread and beer, waiting after long hours of labor, loose linen clothing designed for an unforgiving climate, work organized around the rhythm of the sun, doctors treating injured craftsmen, neighbors sharing knowledge passed from one generation to the next. None of these ideas sound particularly miraculous, and yet, together they accomplish something extraordinary. Sometimes history's greatest innovations aren't dramatic inventions. They're dozens of small decisions repeated faithfully every single day. There's a quiet lesson hidden there. Modern life often celebrates spectacular breakthroughs. The revolutionary app, the miracle diet, the productivity hack guaranteed to change your life overnight. Ancient Egypt whispers a different message. Real survival rarely comes from one brilliant solution. It comes from countless ordinary habits working together. One cup of water, one shared meal, one skilled coworker, one careful decision. Again and again and again. If the internet had existed 3,000 years ago, someone would have tried selling the Pharaoh's 5-step desert success system. The real secret would have been much less exciting. Drink your water. Listen to experienced people. Don't ignore the weather. History can be wonderfully disappointing to influencers. We've also learned something about the people themselves. For generations, many imagined Egypt's greatest monuments as symbols of endless suffering alone. Yet archaeology paints a richer picture. These craftsmen laughed, complained, raised children, borrowed tools, argued with neighbors, skipped work when they were sick, celebrated religious festivals, and when their families went hungry, they organized history's earliest recorded labor strike. In other words, they behaved exactly like people, not legends, not machines, people. Perhaps that's why the village of Deir el-Medina feels so strangely familiar. Its streets disappeared beneath the desert long ago. Its voices fell silent thousands of years before any of us were born. And yet, when we read the workers' notes, when we see their sketches, when we learn their names, the distance between them and us quietly begins to disappear. Technology changes. Governments change. Languages change. Human nature barely notices. Take Pashedu, for example. He never expected strangers from another continent, living more than 3 millennia in his future, to wonder what his mornings looked like. He simply tried to do honest work, support the people he loved, honor his beliefs, and leave behind something worth remembering. Ironically, the kings sought immortality through monuments. Pashedu achieved it through humanity. There's another reason these stories matter. When we admire the pyramids or the painted tombs hidden beneath Egypt's cliffs, it's easy to focus on the finished masterpiece, the towering architecture, the dazzling artwork, the engineering. But every monument begins with something much smaller, a single careful measurement, a single hammer strike, a single worker deciding to return tomorrow. History isn't built all at once. Neither are our own lives. They're shaped by ordinary mornings, quiet routines, small acts of persistence that rarely seem important in the moment, until one day we look back and realize they built something lasting. Maybe that's the greatest gift history offers us. Not instructions for recreating the past, but perspective. When life feels overwhelming, when the work ahead seems endless, when tomorrow already feels exhausting, remember those anonymous craftsmen climbing into the desert before sunrise. They didn't conquer the heat by pretending it wasn't there. They accepted its reality, then quietly adapted. Sometimes courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply fills another water jar. So the next time you see a photograph of an Egyptian royal tomb or a documentary celebrating the pharaohs, pause for just a moment. Look beyond the kings, beyond the gold, beyond the monuments. Imagine the steady rhythm of chisels echoing through cool stone corridors. Imagine dusty sandals climbing familiar paths before dawn. Imagine families waiting at home with bread still warm from the oven. Because hidden behind every great civilization are ordinary people doing extraordinary work, one day at a time. Thank you for spending this quiet evening beneath the ancient Egyptian sky with me. I hope tonight reminded you that history isn't only about rulers who shaped the world. It's also about workers who shaped the stones beneath their feet, parents who returned home after long days, neighbors who shared food, friends who made one another laugh beneath an unforgiving sun. Across more than 3,000 years, their tools may have changed, their language may have faded, but their resilience, their kindness, and their hope still feel remarkably familiar. So as the desert grows quiet and the stars slowly return above the Valley of the Kings, may you carry one final thought into the night. The strongest civilizations were never built by extraordinary people alone. They were built by ordinary people who refused to stop caring for their craft, for one another, and for tomorrow. Sleep well, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next chapter of Boring History to Sleep.